Hello everybody and welcome to ChessDiagnostic. This is Andrew and we're on round 4 of the Fischer vs. Taimanov Candidates Match 1971. So I'm titling this video The Story of the Good Bishop versus the Bad Knight. And we get another Sicilian going into the endgame. And this is probably my favorite game of all the entire matches that Bobby Fischer played on his road to the World Championship. And the reason for that is it's a very artful and incredible endgame. So let's see what happens. After e4, c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, just going for a very solid Sicilian, really nothing tactical in these positions. Takes, knight takes, queen to c7, knight to c3, developing the knight, e6, and then Bobby Fischer chooses g3, an old favorite of his, playing the King's Indian against the Sicilian. So after a6, we see the bishop develop, knight to f6, castles, and then knight takes. So in this position, Taimanov decides to not castle. And in the opening, in other videos I've talked about the three main things that you want to accomplish in the opening, which is developing the pieces, the minor pieces, castling, and then connecting your rooks, normally by moving your queen. But accomplishing those three objectives, you play a good opening. And we see Taimanov violate the second one. He doesn't castle. Queen takes, bishop attacking the queen with a tempo, and of course Fischer's not just going to move his queen. Queen to d2 is actually, that's the best square, but it would be in front of the bishop. So he plays bishop to f4, attacking the queen himself, and then d6, queen to d2. Now the bishop's in front of the queen, and he's ready to attack this d6 pawn. Black could castle, and he'd be okay. But instead we see h6. Now rook from a to d1. White has accomplished all of his opening tasks. The rooks are connected. And basically he's in the middle game because he's ready to attack. Notice that black is a little underdeveloped. He has trouble developing this light square bishop. His d6 pawn is attacked. And he hasn't castled yet. So he plays e5 to protect that d6 pawn. But now he's left weak light squares for white to occupy. Bishop back, and then bishop to g4. He could have just castled at this time and resumed development for the opening, but instead bishop to g4, a little slow. And now white has an advantage because of black's weaknesses, namely this backward d6 pawn, as well as his lack of development. Bishop takes, and now the bishop couldn't take that rook because of bishop takes d6, attacking the queen, and then being up material. So then we see f3 chasing the bishop back, f4 immediately going for tension in the center and attacking, and black could still castle at this time. Instead, rook from a8 to d8. So trying to play in the center even though he's not fully developed, and then we see knight to d5. The bishop takes, pawn takes, and now Fischer is left with a very slight but lasting advantage for white. He has the bishop against this knight. If they go into an endgame, white will be standing better. So after a couple moves, after e4, cutting off the support of that d5 pawn, white could have just simply played c4, protecting that pawn and keeping all the pieces on the board. The c4 pawn could become weak as well, and he would have had a lasting advantage. Instead, we see rook from f to e1, still a good move, using tactics after rook takes d5, rook takes e4. Now if the knight takes, it removes the guard, and he wins that rook back. And now actually black is losing because he's uncastled. The knight would have to go back, check, preventing black from castling, and then he'd win a pawn, going into a totally winning endgame. Alright, so instead we see the king over. And now just a rook trade, and then a queen trade. So this is the key rook versus bishop, rook versus knight endgame. And really, Bobby Fischer got these endgames a lot, because I'm sure he planned that. And he's really a master of playing these endgames. We see a total masterclass from here. And I'm going to cover points. Telling this game is kind of a story, but telling points of how you can apply specific knowledge to play endgames like this. Alright, so why is the bishop a better piece than the knight? Well, it's not really, but theoretically it is in simple positions because the bishop, and of course it depends on the position you're in, but because the bishop controls more squares first off, but it also controls both sides of the board. Now I'm pointing to the rook, but if the bishop was here on e4, it would control both sides of the board. Well, the knight only controls a specific section of the board, and there's only so much it can do to move from one section to the other. It takes time. And that's a huge problem in endgame when you have pawns on both sides of the board. We can see that the D and the E files are cleared of all pawns, and in this specific position, it's very advantageous to have the bishop because all the pawns are flank pawns. Of course, that rook was attacked, rook to e5 attacking the c pawn, as well as the b7 pawn. b6 solves that problem. And then we see a masterclass with Fischer's bishop maneuvers. Bishop to f1, first off attacking the a6 pawn, and then placing his bishop on c4, a much more active square, as well as tying down the rook to the defense of the f7 pawn. Rook to f8, king up. Of course, your king is a piece in the endgame, so he's activating his king. And then Fischer just uses his rook to potentially attack on the b file, but really just to restrict black's king. Now, the problem here is that he can't really advance the f-pawn, because then it leaves this e6 square weak where the rook or the bishop can penetrate. And this knight really has no squares, especially after c3. There's really no point of penetration. An idea of knight to a7 eventually and b5 is stopped by simply a4. Now if the knight moves, he could play rook to e7 check, king up, and then a4, eliminating all counterplay from black. Now a key thing you want to do in endgame is you want to limit all counterplay and take your time doing it. So in the other video, the other endgame I analyzed of Fischer's, I talked about taking your time. Now, the point I want to make from this endgame is that there's two plans that you can follow in a practical endgame. Most endgame positions you get are not going to be theoretical. Now, theoretical endgames have very specific lines that you need to know, but there's relatively few of them, and most of the endgames you're going to get are going to be practical endgames. So in the endgame, there's two main plans that you can follow, and they all surround the stable factor of pawns. So the first plan is to attack your opponent's weak pawns, and the second plan is to use your pawns to create a pass pawn. And Fischer follows the first one of just attacking his opponent's weak pawns first, tying down his pieces, reducing their activity, and then eventually he just goes for a direct attack. Now the knight could come here, but it doesn't really do anything. Rook would just go back, and then if you played that, we get rook to e6. So there's really no good moves for black. He's just completely tied up. Fischer just slowly advances his pawns, and you want to be very careful to advance, or how you advance pawns in the endgame, because it's a stable factor, it's not going to change, and it can leave lasting weaknesses. Alright, so obviously h4, he was planning to play h5 and really cut off all black's counterplay. So black plays h5 himself. Rook to d3, chasing the king back, attacking the pawn, and then f5. So Fischer's just taking his time, shuffling his rook back and forth, and really deciding what to do, seeing what black does. Black's just continuing to advance pawns and create further weaknesses. So at this point, with the bishop pinning the knight, Fischer's plan is to hopefully go for a rook trade, because the king will have to stay over here to protect these dark square pawns, and the knight will be tied down to the defense of the light square pawns. And because Fischer has the bishop, he'll control the entire board. King to e2, preparing a rook trade, and Taimanov allows it. Rook takes, and then we see using the king to enact the second plan. Attacking the opponent's weak pawns, but also trying to create a pass pawn. And how Fischer does that is he'll move his bishop all the way forward to attack the weak pawns, as well as supporting his own pawns. He'll bring the king over to further attack pawns, and then we'll see a sacrifice. So let's see what happens. Knight back, protecting that G7 pawn, G6 pawn. Bishop to E8, tying down the entire position of black. Black really has nothing to do. He'll just shuffle his pieces back and forth, while white will slowly prepare, advancing his king, check. King comes up. You got to be careful with these knight forks, of course. Bishop check. And then Fischer decides to cut off the black king by placing his bishop on F3. After bishop to C7, tying that knight up again, we see the bishop come back, and now it's advantageous. After check, the king comes in further, cutting off the king on C7 from the B6 pawn. And now he's stuck. He's in zugzwang. Knight back, bishop to D5, attacking the knight. Knight up. Just taking his time. Attacking. And now there's really no other move. If the knight moves, then he'll take the pawn. Total zugzwang in this position. If the king moves, he's going to win this pawn. So you have to be ready to sacrifice your piece for the main plan of winning your opponent's pawns, because pawns are the main factor, the main plan in the endgame. So after king to D8, what do you think happens here? Bishop takes on G6. Now the knight takes, and he's going to win all the queenside pawns. Just simply advancing and enacting the second main plan of a practical endgame, going for the pass pawn. Knight back. After B5, knight check. King to B6, king to C8, and then king to C6. After B6, Taimanov resigned. The game's over because these two connected pass pawns are too strong. Even if the knight could sacrifice itself for them, Fischer would just move over and win these other pawns on the king side, and he'd get 3 queens. So a really artful, almost study-like endgame, and the story of how the good bishop beats the bad knight. So, as I said, I'll be in Vietnam in the coming days. I'll probably be making some videos from my laptop there. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll resume the Fischer-Taimanov match in the future.
Jack and Jill went up the hill. Jack and Jill fished